where at any given interest rate, they have now reduced the real, at any given inflation rate, they have now reduced the real interest rate. So now we've gone from R0 to R1. And again, the whole idea would be if we have a negative shock to autonomous spending, by reducing the real interest rate, we can hopefully induce some additional borrowing and spending activity to offset the decline in autonomous expenditures to begin with. So this would be an example of a discretionary monetary policy easing or an expansionary monetary policy. If we had moved in the opposite direction, it would obviously be just the opposite. We would have a contractionary move. So here's an example of some of the data that we've seen over the last couple of years that kind of show exactly this the movements along the monetary policy curve as well as shifts in the monetary policy curve. If we look from essentially the beginning of 2004 until about the middle of 2006, what we would see is that inflation rose from a little over 1% to a little under 3%. So let's just call it 1 to 3. So inflation went up by 2 percentage points. At the same time, short-term interest rates went from 1% to 5.25%. Now remember, this blue line is the federal funds rate. It's a nominal interest rate. So inflation goes up by 2 percentage points. The nominal interest rate goes up by 4 percentage points, a little more than 4. So, of course, that means that the real interest rate went up by 2 percentage points. This is simply a movement along the monetary policy curve. As inflation rose, the central bank must increase the nominal interest rate by more than the increase in inflation in order to increase the real interest rate. And that's what we see here. Now, when we go from roughly middle of 2007 on, notice what happens. Inflation falls from, say, 3% back to 1%. And what happens? We see the central bank brings down the nominal interest rate with that lower rate of inflation. Once again, what we saw in the early part was a slide up the monetary policy curve. What we see here is a slide back down the monetary policy curve. Now, you can also see that they brought interest rates down more than the drop in inflation. Right? So inflation came back roughly to the level it was at back in 2004, but we have interest rates going to 0 rather than to 1%. So there's also some discretionary monetary policy easing taking place in here. That is, they shifted the monetary policy curve lower. And that's easier to see if we look at this period right in here. So here, the inflation rate went up. The nominal interest rate stayed the same. So, of course, the real interest rate went down. Remember, real interest rate is nominal minus expected inflation. So the real interest rate went down as inflation went up. This can only happen if you have a discretionary monetary policy easing. Shift the MP curve lower, which is exactly what happened. We don't have to worry about the rest of the time period in there. Now, we can take our monetary policy curve. We can combine it with our IS curve from Tuesday. And what we can derive from that combination is something known as the aggregate demand curve. So remember that the IS curve is a relationship between the real interest rate and economic output. The MP curve is a relationship between the real interest rate and inflation. Notice we have the real interest rate in both of those. The aggregate demand curve is a relationship between inflation and economic output. So we're taking one of the variables from the IS curve, economic output, and one variable from the MP curve, inflation. That's the relationship we want to look at. And that relationship, which turns out to be an inverse relationship, is known as the aggregate demand curve. So we can see how this all works by the following illustration. Let's suppose that the inflation rate is pi naught, whatever that might be. On the MP curve, we'll be at point A, which means that we have a real interest rate of R naught. Central bank's happy. So if the central bank has set the real interest rate at R naught, let's take it and move that real interest rate over to our IS curve. And so here we are on the IS curve with exactly the same interest rate that we came out of on our monetary policy curve. We have a point A here as well. Equilibrium in the market for goods and services would say now we have to have an economic output level of Y naught. So notice that we've got Y naught and we started with pi naught over here. Let's put those two in the same diagram. With inflation on the vertical axis and economic output on the horizontal axis, find that combination, that's point A. So point A in this inflation economic output space is consistent with point A on our IS curve and point A on our monetary policy curve. Now, let's change inflation. So if inflation is then higher, for some reason, goes up to pi 1, the central bank will want to, along the monetary policy curve, increase the real interest rate to R1. So again, this is just a movement up along the monetary policy curve. We can then take this real interest rate, move it over to our IS curve, find out where R1 is, higher. And where does that mean we have to be on the IS curve to be in equilibrium in the market for goods and services? We have to be at point B, which also means that we have a lower level of economic output. Lower level of economic output. So notice what we did. We raised the inflation rate, which caused the central bank to increase the real interest rate, which reduced the amount of borrowing and spending in economic output. Higher inflation, lower level of economic output. Now let's put that in our new diagram. We said let's have a higher rate of inflation, and that led to a lower level of economic output. So now we've got point B in this space as well. So all the point B's are consistent, just as the point A's were. Now, of course, we could continue this with different levels of inflation, but what we would end up with is this inverse relationship between inflation and the level of aggregate economic activity. This is known as the aggregate demand curve, the aggregate demand curve. So we're now talking about how much demand is there in the overall economy. Now, the one thing to note about this, we still don't know what the actual level of economic activity is. Right? We only have a demand curve. We can't know where the economy actually is with only a demand curve. So next week, we'll also be developing a supply curve. But before we go there, we've got a few other things that we need to see. One is, it's important to keep in mind why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The reason that it's downward sloping, if you remember your microeconomics at all, the reason a demand curve in microeconomics is downward sloping is because as the price rises, buyers substitute out of the higher price good into lower price substitutes. That is not, let me repeat, that is not what is happening here. There is no substitution effect at the macroeconomic level. Right? It's awfully hard to substitute out of real GDP. We're aggregating everything together. The reason that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping is because as inflation rises, the real interest rate increases. It's the higher real interest rate through raising borrowing costs that reduces economic activity. It's an interest rate effect, not a substitution effect. It's the fault of the central bank, right? Because they're anti-inflation. Okay. So we have to think about this aggregate demand curve in terms of, if we were to write an equation for the aggregate demand curve, what depends on what? In this case, our endogenous variable is economic activity. Why? The aggregate demand curve shows us how economic activity changes when there are changes in inflation. Because we only have one curve at this point. Inflation would be our exogenous variable. Economic activity would be our endogenous variable. Right? It's changes in inflation that cause changes in economic output for the aggregate demand curve, not the other way around. Now, of course, as we know, the IS curve can shift for a variety of reasons, and the MP curve can shift for a variety of reasons. So what we need to see is, how do those shifts affect the aggregate demand curve? When we constructed the aggregate demand curve, you saw that it depended upon the IS curve and the MP curve, which obviously means if you change the location of either the IS curve or the MP curve, or maybe both, you're also going to change the location of the aggregate demand curve. That is, a shift in the IS curve or a shift in the MP curve will also lead to a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So what shifts the IS curve? Wow, well, if you remember that big, ugly equation that we had last time, again, you can close your eyes, throw your hands up, and go, that big, ugly equation. Well, when we change the exogenous variables in that equation, the IS curve is going to shift. If the IS curve shifts, guess what? The aggregate demand curve is going to shift. So these are the things that we saw last time which shift the IS curve. Notice we have all of our autonomous spending components: autonomous consumption, autonomous planned investment, autonomous government purchases, autonomous net exports. We also have autonomous foreign real economic activity and autonomous taxes, autonomous financial frictions. So those were all those things that were in the numerator of that first part of our IS equation. We also can have changes in the real exchange rate. Again, we're not going to pay too much attention to that now, but we will be coming back to it later when we talk about international trade and exchange rates more carefully. So changes in any of these variables, then, will cause the IS curve to shift. So let's suppose, then, that we start at point A. And we now have an increase in some autonomous spending component. It doesn't really matter which of those ones that it is. So I'm just going to call this an increase in autonomous consumption. So if consumers, for every level of income, now decide they want to spend more, we should see at every interest rate level that economic activity will rise. And since the actual level of interest rates does not matter for this example, what we see is that this can be represented by a rightward shift of the IS curve. Of course, this would be true for any increase, or an increase in any of the autonomous expenditure variables. So the IS curve now shifts to the right. So let's see what would happen at the same interest rate level. Now, I'm not saying that the interest rate won't change. We need a complete model before we can see everything that happens. But let's just pick an interest rate level and see what happens. Right? So if we pick that one, we've now brought the real interest rate over to our monetary policy curve. We're still at point A on our monetary policy curve. So we've got the same interest rate that we have for our IS curve. So if the central bank is happy with that real interest rate, it's at an inflation rate of pi naught. So what we basically said is that at any inflation rate, if we look at the interest rate associated with any inflation rate, economic activity will have increased. We see that from our IS curve, which means now that point B is our new equilibrium. So the aggregate demand curve has also shifted to the right. So this leads us then to a really, really simple rule of thumb. Any factor that causes the IS curve to shift to the right will also cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. The IS curve and the aggregate demand curve shift in the same direction when the movement is from the IS curve to the aggregate demand curve. So changes in the IS curve will also tell us exactly what kind of change to expect in the aggregate demand curve. Shift the IS curve to the right, you will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right in the same direction. Now we can also ask, what happens if monetary policy changes? We could either have a discretionary easing of monetary policy or a discretionary tightening of monetary policy. So just to have fun, let's have a tightening. So let's suppose that our bar increases. So if our bar is increasing, we can say at our initial inflation rate, pi naught, the central bank now wants to have a higher real interest rate, R1. And as we've seen, this can be shown more generally as an upward shift of the monetary policy curve. Now let's see what happens because of this higher real interest rate. Let's take this real interest rate over to our IS curve. So the higher real interest rate on the IS curve says less borrowing, less spending, less economic output. So this would be point B. So we've got this decline in economic output because of this tighter monetary policy. So we didn't change the inflation rate, but we ended up with a lower level of economic output. So now our equilibrium point is point B. Or more generally, what we see is the aggregate demand curve has shifted to the left. So again, just real quickly, we tightened monetary policy. We had a discretionary contractionary monetary policy, raising the value of our bar, which causes the monetary policy curve to shift up, raising the real interest rate at any given inflation rate. That higher real interest rate will, along the IS curve, lead to lower level of economic activity. And that lower level of economic activity then occurred at the same inflation rate, because that's where we started all of this. So that can also be represented by a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Now, if we think about this shift of the MP curve, I said this was an upward shift. You can clearly see that by the way I drew the arrow. But if we look at this on a horizontal basis, we can also call this a leftward shift. So it either shifted up or it shifted to the left if we think horizontally. Think horizontally for a minute. The MP curve shifted to the left. The aggregate demand curve shifted to the left. Oh, didn't we find this with the IS curve too? Whichever direction, horizontally, the monetary policy curve shifts, the aggregate demand curve will also shift in that same direction. Shift the MP curve to the left, aggregate demand shifts to the left. Shift MP to the right, aggregate demand shifts to the right. So this helps. These are very nice rules of thumb. You don't have to think really hard about which direction the aggregate demand curve is shifting if you know which direction the IS curve or the MP curve is shifting. Now, a couple of things I want to point out, coming back to our first example. So this is where we shifted the IS curve. This is our change in economic output. That change in economic output is exactly the same as the change in economic output we would see on our aggregate demand curve. They have to be the same. Likewise, when we change the monetary policy, there's no change in the monetary policy curve diagram that shows economic output. But we do see a change in economic output because of the change in interest rates. That change in economic output is exactly the same as the change in economic output from our aggregate demand curve shift. So what's happening on the horizontal axis in terms of economic output has to be exactly the same between the IS curve and the aggregate demand curve. Okay. Before we move on, just let me point out. We know that if the IS curve shifts to the right, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. We also know that if the MP curve shifts to the right, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. What do we know if the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right? If the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, then we know either that the IS curve is shifted to the right or the MP curve is shifted to the right. But unless we have more information, we don't know which one. IS curve shifts, MP curve shifts, we know exactly what's going to happen to aggregate demand. If the aggregate demand curve shifts, we don't know where it came from without more information. So when we think about the flow of information that we have, it's easy to go from IS curve, MP curve to the aggregate demand. It's a lot more difficult trying to go backwards. So keep that in mind. Now at the beginning, one of the things that I mentioned was that central banks exercise monetary policy by controlling nominal short-term interest rates. And they do so in a way that will generate the real interest rate that they're trying to achieve. So we need to think then about how they actually go about setting the nominal short-term interest rate. And the nominal short-term interest rate is actually set in something that's known as the money market. The money market.